After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
Although I don't know, at some point I need to talk to you about, like, the only book on Indian history I have is like a John Kay book, who also has a book on China, but he's just like this British dude, and it seems like he's fairly as neutral as he can be, but it's also just like, I don't know.
That sounds like one of the better options, because the thing about Indian history is like there is a lot of scholarship, but in the West, a lot of it is still drawn from, like the kind of proto-Nazis, like in the way that people will take Nietzsche for being a proto-Nazi, but there were a lot of scholars around him who like wanted it to interpret it that way.
Yeah.
There's one German historian, I forget what his name was, but if you talk to like people in his generation, they'll be like, oh yeah, this guy was a fraud. But he was basically the one who made the equivalency between like Aryans as like a nomadic people across Central Asia also being German in some capacity.
Oh, yeah,
So he conflated a bunch of things to, conflated that along with like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and like all that shit.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so there's aspect to it that like, the Aryans, what they are, who they are, like that's been conflated woefully in Western history. Also, just that a lot of the initial bit of historical studies came from like British colonial records, right? So they were targeted in what, like, how do we exploit this for colonial enterprise more so than actual historical or archaeological study.
Well, I mean, it's also that like yeah, there's that, and then it's like the it's weird because like my understanding of a lot of like the Indian subcontinent is like based on reading stuff from like proto history. So it's like I could tell you like pretty accurately like what India looked like in the year 1000, um, in the way that like like Western Indian coast countries, because of what there's that big ass mountain range on the western coast of India. Like, so all these Western towns and port cultures sort of developed in like a really different way from like in like the rest of the country, and are like, from what I understand from my reading, are a lot more like Arab and sort of African in the way that they interact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It was like the route went from like from like the western coast of India to the Persian Gulf to like basically the Horn of Africa, back and forth. And so like all these dudes ended up having, like that's where you get like the Indians who are Muslims and shit like that. It's like from like these big routes, but it's like I don't think people realize either. It's like, oh yeah, when you're saying like the colonial sort of history of India can end up being a little more accurate. It's like, well, yeah, because like the world system started in like fucking 800 AD. We've all been up in each other's shit for a really long time, gang.
Older if you want to like look at the Silk Road and shit too.
Yeah, I mean, like there was a book I was reading. I don't know if you can believe that. No, this John Wickham book, The Inheritance of Rome. It's I think about like 280 to 1200 AD, and it talks about like all of these networks were already set up and everything was already kind of moving. And the Silk Road was this main route, and then it started to develop all of these arterial routes after the collapse of Rome because it allowed new markets to form. And like I don't, as somebody who thinks about like things that are not necessarily correlation or things that are not necessarily causation but are correlation, it's like like the reason we're talking right now is because I sort of started looking at 1953. It was like MK Ultra and oil, and it's like the dissolution of Rome happened so close to the dissolution of the last Khanate that you had these like big ass like abilities for like land to sort, and not like the last Khanate, but the last like mega Khanate, collapsed within like I think 150 years after the collapse of Rome. Like the last holdings that like Genghis had before his sons just started carving the motherfucker up. Right. He had, like, 80 sons who each had 80 grandchildren, all the rest of it. And so like the Khanates fell apart pretty quickly.
Pretty much it's a 4 competing bodies at that point, yeah.
Yeah. Like it's well, I have like I have my water, I have my coffee, I have my stack of books I wanted to reference while we're talking to you. We're recording. I think I'm probably good to go whenever you want to start. You tell me how this goes. I'm just following your lead.
I mean, dude, you basically cold opened this episode for me. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So yeah, welcome back to the Greenhouse, dear listeners. I'm joined by my buddy Charlie. You can follow him on Twitter as @HeavenlySpit. And this episode kind of comes out of some extended conversations we've been having since I think we met on like a Twitter space, I want to say a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I think we very quickly started orbiting each other's ideas, and I think sort of have been helping each other develop some things that I don't really know if we were even consciously thinking about. I feel like there's been a good interplay of oh hey man, like I was thinking about this thing you said to me, and you don't know that I've been thinking about this other thing, but it totally came up in that. So yeah.
Yeah. So the initial discussion we were having was kind of, I mean, these discussions are always vague, but like the big recurring theme that's been coming up in our discussions, and something that's been a goal for me here when I started the podcast was, how do you get people out of, particularly like people who are stuck in like a more liberal form of thought, right? Where they may be more concerned with ideals, virtue, behaviors, and norms. How do you get them out of it? And for me, like pushing people towards a coherent analysis of power and material reality has always been like the answer. I'm not necessarily the most well-read person on that, but I find that to be the most effective, because when people get confused, it's because they don't seem to have a good idea of who's holding the power. Why do they do that? And that came up in our discussion, and we kind of both had a moment of like, okay, this guy gets it, that, materialist analysis is what makes things when you're trying to look at complex ass shit.
Yeah, I think one of the first conversations that you and I had that was like any real substance. We started like sort of really bouncing ideas off each other was like about not to jump too far ahead, but materialism inside the record industry.
Right.
I think I'd spoken to you of like um I've been involved in punk communities for a decent amount of my life. And you get so many people who are like, especially after basically the entire industry had a big sort of forced like soft reset during COVID, like all the venues shut down, bands
Mm-hmm.
stopped touring. People would talk to me about like, okay, after the fact, when shows come back, what do we want them to look like, and how are we going to keep these communities equitable? And for me, my response to it with a good number of people was sort of like multi-tiered. It's like, well, you need to do the thing where performances happen earlier. They can't be at like 9 o'clock at night on weekdays. They need to be
Mm-hmm.
centralized and available to like working people and busy people. And at this point, with the amount of like weird schedules people have, I don't think it would be a worst thing ever to like, I know people who are bartenders who would love to be able to go see like a cool band play like noon or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just sort of, I started extrapolating from there. And it's like, well, you're also going to need to make rehearsal spaces basically like free. If you want to have an equitable music industry, you're going to need to make the instruments free. You're going to need to have a very clear-eyed and sober analysis of the demographics in this country that have been able to accumulate the sort of wealth that you need to start a rock band. Like you need to have like a decent amount of money to buy a guitar or a drum kit or an amplifier, and you need to have the ability to set aside the time to write songs and to practice. But even past that, I don't see how you get past the material construction of the industry itself, because sooner or later you're going to have to figure out what is exactly equitable about providing, Black, brown, and poor people in the first world with all of this advanced music equipment that is almost exclusively sourced off of the third world. You're kind of suggesting that people domestically should be asking people who are exactly like them, just unfortunate enough to not live in America, to sacrifice their, comfort and their stability so that you can have a bunch of people here like playing the guitar. um, which doesn't really seem like it's that doesn't really seem like a fair trade-off to me, and I don't think that it either is fair when you sort of imply that people should be mechanisms of their own international exploitation so long as they can receive some sort of benefit on the hyper-local level. And I started to see that as like a microcosm for a lot of the way that I remember talking to you about this, and it's definitely developed into it's helped me develop this sort of like larger gnawing thing, this sort of this overarching look at the way that the entire mass media industry is basically predicated on dumping products and dumping tech onto tech, for lack of a better word, onto the general public of the first world, and then diversifying the types of demographics that will be attracted to that tech through, podcasts, music, movies, the mass media, whatever. And, I think a decent amount of people inside of our sphere sort of talk about like the concept of like the psyop or the larger conspiracy or whatever, and you start to realize like there is none. It's just the actual material construction of the world itself is the op. That's the framing, is that you're unable to escape that sort of like structure of exploitation. And I think at this point it's more, and the conversation you and I have been having is sort of like, okay, now what do we do with that observation? What does God want me to do with this information? Um,
Yeah, no, I mean that's a very cogent analysis of like some of the stuff I've been observing too, because I've been, I guess, for like a year now trying to make sense of like consumerism and these massive networks like you described of like ebb and flow of supply materials at the expense of the third world to the benefit of the first world, right? And it's very easy to, in addition to trying to figure out like what do I do with, also very easy to get caught up in things that may not necessarily be relevant to finding the answers, right? And you can kind of get ad busters with the kind of stuff you do, you do to criticize, right? And I think a lot of like what comes up in anti-consumerist spaces, not that I think it's necessarily bad, but I think it kind of misses the forest for the trees, is that, it's bad, it's anti-moral, it makes you greedy. And that's not necessarily untrue, right? But I always kind of harken back to that old Engels quote, which is humanity is downstream from material reality. And then the question should then be reframed into, who does this order benefit? And it sounds obvious, it sounds very trite, but it's like, once again, the global elite, the 1%, the bourgeois, whatever term you're going to use, still benefits from this order. And they get to profit in the short and long term by maintaining these kinds of weird relationships of material reality, right? And this is the order that capitalism is predicated on in the present day.
yeah, I think one of the things that's been um I think that there's a lot of, as far as you're looking at the forest for the trees, and I think Adbusters is a good example. I think it's parallel to a lot of other things that um we're sort of critiquing or interested in poking at. And that, it's you're if you're inside of a capitalist system that's predicated on a sort of like neo-imperialist, like a globalization, like a material structure and exploitation structure, it doesn't really matter what is in the ad busters. You're still just a magazine company. You're still just exploiting the third world to put out this magazine. Or I think one of the things that, I mean, not to put you on blast or to make this.
No, I think you should bring it up. I think you should bring it up.
You want me to bring up podcasts, don't you?
Yes, because it's very critical you bring up that point.
Yeah, the thing with podcasts is like, well, it's a bunch of people arguing over what the right and wrong podcasts are that we're all listening to on the same fucking phones.
But more than that, yeah, exactly. Like at some level, whether or not you can sell the right ideas on your podcast, it may be even tertiary to the fact that like podcasts remain a selling feature to sell iPhones.
Exactly. It's like, oh, if you can't find a podcast you like, don't worry, we have another one of a different type. And so it's always, yeah, it's funny to me when people say that certain podcasts or like certain people in media at this point are like where, look, I don't care if certain podcast hosts are CIA assets or NSA agents or whatever. Like I would consider that to be irrelevant. There's a political economy that needs to come into play, and the political economy of thinking that something sucks that's a part of the mass media is you turn it off. Like that's about as far as you can go with it. But yeah, I think a lot about a lot of this stuff, and I'm sure that this is some deep philosophical thought that somebody else came up with. 'Cause I remember reading it somewhere, but I can't remember who said it. Was that every act of seeing has an act of not seeing. There's something you're not seeing when you're looking at the things you're looking at. And I think it's incredibly I think you're doing the equivalent of running an op on yourself by saying like, oh, I've learned that, the mass media is this big control system. And so it's obviously like, there's people who are assigned roles inside of it. And so I could sit here and name like podcast hosts and CNN anchors and shit, but I'm just like not interested in that because like whatever they're saying is irrelevant to the fact that you already bought the fucking phone. They got what the structure got what it wanted out of you. And it wants you to keep on buying new phones. And so we'll keep on putting out new content that will keep on making further and further micro demographics so long as like you pick up an iPhone 15 or whatever when it comes out. Like, and the structure of complaint around this entire media system where you pull up Twitter and you bitch about it on your phone, and it's like regardless of there's an entirely separate conversation that I don't know if you and I want to get into today about like the surveillance economy, but you don't even have to have a critique about that, to still see that this entire like media structure is based on you buying new phones, buying new televisions, buying new video game consoles. And dude, I love my iPhone. I love playing my Xbox on my TV. I'm not going to sit here and try and like outmoral anybody, but it's I think you need to have like some sort of critique about like they don't care what you're listening to. They don't care about your protest music. They don't care about like your fucking like your anti-capitalist screeds that you're still publishing through book companies. They don't care about your anti-capitalist music that you're still pressing on records, or you tell me whenever you want to start jumping into the reasons that we're talking today. But it's the entire structure kind of gets what it wants out of you and is going to create new demographics of sales throughout, like, and that will include things like communists, anarchists, libertarians, anti-capitalists, every like there's no critiques against the system are part of the system. That's the kind of ugly beauty of it. It's an elegant mechanism for sure. That I mean, I think recently in the wake of we're recording this at the end of August 2022, and there's been floods in Kentucky. What the floods in Pakistan have displaced like literally like 30 million people. So we're sort of like we're getting to a point now where it's like we're kind of having to accept that there's been no critique of the system made inside the system that has taken the system down. More than likely, climate change is going to take it down. But it's not going to be anything that, like, you know, the people do, the proletariat or the masses or you and me or the podcast audiences. Like, that's actually, those things are kind of irrelevant because, like, and it's not just that, it's not necessarily that we don't have any power, but we give that power up on every single level. There's no walking away clean from the structure at this point. And that, I mean, oh, in a way where I hate that I have to say, like, I'm not advocating doing like the bombing thing, but you have to end up like Ted Kaczynski. You have to like move out to the woods, dude. Like that's basically it.
Yeah, at some level, you have to pull yourself out of the system.
Or you have to learn how to, you know, live with the contradictions that exist inside of it, which is
right.
And I think that what ends up happening is like people end up realizing that there are contradictions that they're sort of like grinding against daily and don't really know how to handle that, you know. So they, and I think like one of the things that happens to Americans specifically, because we are such an exceptionalist and individualist country, is that we try, and the natural inclination and the mentality is to pin it on a person,
Mm-hmm.
is to say like, oh, it's like it's this guy, you know, or it's this broadcaster, or it's this political group or something. And it's like a larger structural thing, you know. It's a
Mm-hmm.
thing that we're all having a hard time escaping. Like, you know, you know, I had some friends over the other night, and I was you know, I was talking with my friend who used to be involved pretty heavily in a local like mutual aid group, which is something that I think like, you know, you and I've talked about. And she now works for a much larger organization that's connected to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing she was saying was, she was just like, I realized that we were just replicating the systems that were present. You know, we had
Mm-hmm.
like, we were very much like, oh, we're an anarchist group, and you know, we feed the people, and we have like we take like, we have like a Cash App, and like we have like a Patreon every month. And it was just like, and I realized like I'm just doing like an anarchist branded NGO at this point, and there are local groups in my town that are bigger that could handle a little bit better. Um, and I needed to sort of accept like that, like it didn't really matter how good I wanted to do this thing. If I'm just still replicating the system, I may as well, like, you know, work with something that's already in my town that's accomplishing that, as opposed to like confusing myself and putting myself in a space where I'm not really um like it's one thing to say that you're doing something like that, and another to approach it with a material analysis that would prove to you that you are not, and then try and reconcile that. And so you may as well just go work for the local church outreach at that point, that's like doing a lot more than you are, you know.
I think you hit the nail on the head with a lot of that, right? Which is like, I think my criticism has always been with like, you know, oh, liberals or people of other, you know, persuasions, whatever, seem to have an allergy to understanding power for what it is. And I think the reason why is like, as you've pointed out, is, you know, pointing out contradictions very obviously creates cognitive dissonance. And no one wants to deal with the distress and confusion that causes, right? But something that we talked about, like both in a personal context, but as well as like just in an abstract logical one too, is that exposing the contradictions for what they are is actually liberating in a way, because it frees you from the confusion caused by trying to hold something together that makes sense to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So this is, you know, this is kind of why I'm hoping to spread the good word of materialist analysis in today's episode. And I kind of wanted to bring up two of the Twitter threads you had done. I want to say a couple weeks ago. So the first one was about the Bolloré family and their various business interests in petrochemicals, music, and PR.
Um, yeah, that was an interesting thread to tug. I had for a long time it's sort of been if you have a critique of like for lack of a better term, the carbon economy, the way that
Mhm.
oil flows throughout the world, and maybe um, I don't really know if the average person is super well versed in like the history of oil. I am not myself. But some of the things that I think are the key points to understand about it are that it wasn't really discovered until the 1850s. There are not that many countries that produce oil, and that the big shifting point for a lot of the world system was 1914 when Winston Churchill converted the British Navy from coal to oil to power the
Mhm.
ships. Um, and in the midst of all of this, you have like this massive reshuffling of the way that like if you start to look at maps of like the Middle East, you see like the train lines start to move around like other people's other companies and other countries bidding wars for territories. You start to see that the one of the things that I thought was most interesting was actually I want was the I want to say Khalili's book, Sinews of War and Trade, that had a long section about a construction company in the Middle East that started out by being a dredging company and then found that there was a particular type of sand that was better for concrete construction than other sand, and ended up dredging areas for new ports, not based around what the most logical distribution points were, but based on where the best sand could be extracted. And
Mhm.
inside of this multi-tiered company that was a dredging, import construction, and logistics company, um, and um, and I think one of the bigger things that happened was in the aftermath of World War II, you had a big glut of oil diversify itself throughout like the entire world economy. Like the introduction of polyester into clothing, vinyl records, gasoline cars really slammed against the market in like this sort of like freedom way. And all of this is kind of like a long introduction to this company, Bolloré, who are a French holding company, but who also are the largest, I want to say, are the largest stakeholders or shareholders in Universal Music,
Mhm.
um, which, I mean,
How they run it as a
Universal,
subsidiary through one of their companies, but that's a separate point.
yeah, it's, and Universal Music is a massive label. I know that you can edit this at this point, right?
Yeah. But I mean, to the listeners,
Yeah,
benefit.
if you punch into Google real quick and you punch in bands Universal Music Group, you're gonna see Queen, Black Sabbath, Pearl Jam, Guns N' Roses, One Republic, All American Rejects, Snow Patrol, 30 Seconds Tomorrow, BTS, Ramstein, huge bands, ABBA, Kiss. This is a huge, huge company.
Around
Um,
the world. Yeah.
yeah, a global company. Anyways, Bolloré, this holding company, who are also one of the major stakeholders in them, they're an oil or Bolloré. They're an oil and petrochemicals distribution company is what they majorly do. But they're also involved in port construction, and they also own a PR company. And um, they've been caught up in a series of scandals throughout Africa and Southern Europe, because they basically have been going to different political candidates who are running for office around the west coast of Africa and offering them free PR and free radio station airtime through Universal, so long as those candidates, if they get elected, will grant them access to port construction contracts. Um, and I was blown away by this whole structure when I first saw it, and it immediately made me think of that Khalili book that I just referenced, where it's the way that the material construction of the world has consolidated itself into these vertical alignments. And I think one of the things that happened recently around that time is I had a friend around the time I wrote the thread, I had a friend who was complaining about how their band had pressed their record and the record was being delayed by like 9 months, which is pretty typical at this point. I had some friends that I helped press records with back in the mid 2000s, and your turnaround time was like 6 weeks. And now, if your band sent the master to, well, I have some friends who sent me a master of one of their records in March of this year, and it's not coming out till March of next year. So the delay time has increased very much. But if you look at the global distribution of oil, the servers for most of online music are in Europe. So that just means that the same amount of oil is coming out. It's just being distributed to way fewer places at this point. And you're seeing the Americas are tightening their distribution cycle, as well as the is there a word for like the, I mean, there's like, I've heard Eurasia, I've heard Africa, I've heard Middle East. I don't know, is there a word that we describe Asia and Africa and Europe as yet?
I've heard a corporate abbreviation, EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, EMEA.
Okay, yeah, but the world has two big land masses on it, basically, right? The Americas and Africa, Europe, Asia, and then scattering of the islands on the way to Australia, and that's those two distribution cycles are becoming further and further detached from each other, through a variety of insurance reasons and climate change reasons, and just it's easier to. Well, why would you distribute oil all the way over here to America from the Middle East to press records so people can hear music when you could just distribute it to Switzerland where their music servers are? It makes sense from a business point of view. I think there was like that sort of led me. I had some issues with that Bolloré thread because I don't think I did as good of a job on it as I could have, to be honest with you. I think I could have gone a little bit further, especially the introduction of those the introduction of the port structure system around the same time that Universal Music Africa and a bunch of like African offices were opening. And so it was just this like massive rollout of like radio stations and media industries alongside this major corporation that was opening new ports. And then I want to say I was talking to Jimmy about this, and he brought up that somebody in a conversation I was having with Jimmy about it commented that Bolloré at this point has basically been forced to sell most of their fleet off to this large Italian mega tanker company. But it seems like they might be still like leasing the fleet back, so they haven't had to really give up operations. I don't know. It's Bolloré is also one of those companies, when you look through the history of it, it's like basically like 4 generations of like, this guy had to be removed in disgrace, and then his son came into play, and then he had to be removed in a scandal, and his son came in. So it's a revolving door of family members. So if somebody ends up getting removed because they were up to something shady, well, there's always like a nephew or an uncle or a son who can come in and take over, and operations stay going basically exactly as they were. And like, let's not put the cart before the horse here. Who has more money, the company that makes the oil or the company that ships the oil? The company that makes the oil are the ones who make it. They're going to figure out a way to ship it, So, but yeah, the to backtrack a little bit into the 50s, if you would like me to keep on elaborating here on the sort of the the counterculture, MK Ultra, and the carbon economy.
Yeah, that was your second thread, but they both segue into each other, so you can proceed with that.
Yeah. The I started thinking more and more about like this this cycle of material exploitation, and it's. I mean, let me ask you. I don't know if you and I have ever had this talk. What does the phrase "the '60s was a psyop" mean to you?
It's tough, right? But I think the vibe people are trying to carry across with that statement is that it's psychologically reconditioned people, is what I think people are pointing at. At the same time, especially with online discourse, right, is that a lot of these terms are used interchangeably, and one person's psyop means one thing versus another, right?
I'm definitely at this point very interested in the material basis of a psyop for sure.
Right.
That everybody would benefit from, like, okay, describe what that means and describe how it functions.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like when people say the 60s were a psyop, I think it's a useful statement. Don't get me wrong, but it could mean anything from they were putting LSD in the water supply and everyone lost their dens, or it incentivized Americans to behave in more individualistic, selfish, and reactionary ways.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to give into the whole like MK Naomi thing to like think that things were not good in the in the 60s, I think. Yeah, I lean more toward the latter.
Okay.
The more by the 60s was a psyop. I get where that comes from, but I think that it, for me, the first time I heard that, it resonated in a way that I think was more about like a general statement about like the counterculture at large, or the concept of counterculture. Because especially, you sort of get to, I'm always willing to meet people where they are. And so if somebody says to me like, oh, okay, I think that like, it's really an extension of people saying like podcasters are assets or something. Like, okay, well, let's follow that historical trend then. Let's see where we go with it. Because I think one of the things that like I've sort of noticed is like there's like a grinding disconnect between like, or like one of the dialectical grinds that I've observed is the ways that the first world incorporates like the concept of the hippies into how its leftism is going to function. Because I mean, you get people who are like, oh, the hippies were like a totally constructed thing. You also get people like, Mark Fisher wrote about like acid communism, bringing back like the spirit of 68. So you have like a pretty wide wide range with total rejection to enthusiastic support, including like the sort of psychedelic aspects of it. And yeah, I think the 60s as psyop is a lot more of a it's when the mass media state sort of moved into focus. And I think sort of having an understanding of what the mass media is kind of like lost. And I think the function of things like, the PSYOP or MK Ultra, I think all those things, like, I get where people are coming from when things are sort of diversified into this like wide variety of terms, but like when people talk about like I, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, but like which is something somebody says before they're about to. I would say that like MK Ultra and mass media and the CIA and COINTELPRO and Chaos and the Phoenix program and Operation Jakarta, et cetera, Operation Gladio, all this stuff. It's really about all of those things center around the concept of capitalist social control. Making the public do what you want globally, which all of those things sort of come out of a globalization milieu, like a point when America took over all of the former imperial holdings, basically. All of those things erupt at the same moment, and that they all focus on is keeping the entire world docile with their noses against the grindstone, pushing the machine forward. And so I think that and I think that things get sort of muddy in the descriptions of these things when they're tried to be. It's like that John Muir quote, man. Like, you can't tug on a single thing and not have the universe come with it. And if you're going to start tugging at the threads of like these massive, like, American government-based social control programs from the 50s and 60s, like, you're going to notice that like a lot of them are trying to achieve the same material ends. They're all trying to create pretty similar material realities. and they all sort of like interlock into each other. And I I wish I could really like full-throatedly endorse Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I have some critiques of it myself, but I think that's a really important book. Um, for specifically for a section in the middle, and I don't know if it's necessarily important for everybody, but I think for people who sort of like I think for people who have gotten into parapolitics as an extension of their Marxism, like I have, it's been useful. I don't really know if you're really into conspiracies and then you got into left-wing politics, God bless you, man. I think you have a tough road to hoe. I don't think one necessarily leads into the other, but I think at a certain point, your material analysis is going to lead you into looking into like the parapolitical association between like governments and banks. Ooh. But Zuboff has this long section in the middle of Age of Surveillance Capitalism where she basically writes out that like, MK Ultra and the mass media kind of look like each other. MK Ultra was designed to control the population. Mass media and social media can do that. All of these structures basically play in the same territory. And for me, I started looking into when those trends emerged. When did the big mass media shift happen? And I sort of got hung up on the noticing that MK Ultra, from whatever paperwork is actually left. For anybody not familiar with MK Ultra, it was a series of pretty extreme experiments done on the population and prisoners and hospital patients, basically using drugs and hypnosis and a weirder variety of types of control to see if they could get people to do what they wanted them to. MK Ultra starts in 1953, which is the same year that Masada is ousted in Operation Ajax by the CIA and MI6 or Masada. I'm realizing right now
Mossadegh.
Mossadegh. Thank you. I've realized I've never said the name out loud before. I've just been sitting.
I was just like, which coup did I forget about? Holy shit!
No, Mossadegh. Thank you, Jesus. So 1953, Mossadegh gets ousted, and the Shah gets reinstated in Iran, and the Seven Sisters all start up, which are 7 different oil companies, 5 of which are American run, a couple of which have pretty close ties to the CIA. Oh shit. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought for a minute here. I'm sorry. You're gonna have to edit this. What was I talking about? I'm sorry.
You were talking about Mossadegh got overthrown and they install and the oil industry starts coming up away from the nationalization plan that the Iranians want back to British and American control.
Yeah, so MK Ultra starts going in 1953. In 1953, also you have Mossadegh gets ousted in a coup by the CIA and MI6. MI6 were the British Secret Service spying agency, and basically they kind of forced Truman's hand into starting the OSS in 1946 or 47. 1945, somewhere in there, during World War II, or early World War II, and then by the end of World War II, the group had sort of shifted over into being the CIA. But yeah, in 1953, you had the introduction of social control mechanisms through like deliberate experiments on people, and also at the same time, you had these. After the coup, the Shah got reinstalled. And all of the oil companies, Mossadegh had nationalized before then, and they were denationalized, and control was given back over to these 7 different conglomerates, 5 of which are kind of like 5.5 because of the way that investments work. 5 of which, though, were deliberately American companies. And so, like, when we talk about, like, social control or the 60s being a psyop or something, it's like, I think one of the things that happens is that there's a little too much like weight put on like social control being its own end. or like, mind control or whatever, or any of these, none of these things exist in a vacuum. None of them are there to just be themselves. They're there to produce material realities, and the material reality that they were working with was one that was based on the carbon economy. It was based on this like massive glut of oil into the American economy. And so you see the way that I think that when you look at the amount of like the introduction of like polyester clothing, vinyl records, the Beats start going out and driving cars around the country. So like freedom as a concept is tied into like getting into your car and driving. And you see like all of these elements of social control that are related to consumption, that are dependent on an emerging carbon economy. And so I think that, if in a vacuum, maybe social control exists for its own end, but inside a capitalist country that is moving oil around the world, social control exists to perpetuate capitalism and the carbon economy.
100%, yeah.
And I think one of the things that's been interesting is that or not, I guess interesting, but I would say that to extrapolate off of, and the thread that I wrote this is basically what it's about. It's about the introduction of all of this glut of oil, the introduction of social control mechanisms, and then the invention of rock and roll and all that stuff after it. But I think one of the things that you see end up happening is that it continues being a diversification, like throughout, basically up until now. They start making, you want to make a movie? We got polymer film. What's polymer made out of? You want to be a fashion designer? We can make polyester clothes. What's polyester made out of? You want to be in a band? We can make records. What are records? It moves through the channels that in the past would have been where like the protest is, where the objections to the system would lay. And so all of those things end up becoming components of the dissent itself. There is no authentic dissent because the channels of dissent are fully owned and operated by the last people you would want to have them at this point. That's another one where it's sort of left being now where I think the larger conversation is what to do about all of these things now that we're sort of aware of them. But I didn't know if there was anything specific about either of those threads that you wanted to bring up or you wanted me to bring up that I haven't touched on.
I think what those threads like elucidate, for me at least, right, is like you can't really escape the material reality that undergirds the whole thing, right? And maybe we can, feed this into a discussion about like, where do you draw the line between parapolitical materialist analysis and mere conspiracy theory. But
So
I think
that's an important distinction to make at a certain point for sure.
For sure. But I think it's like, there's a lot of this discussion about like, this is a materialist, that is a materialist. And that gets levied at a lot of people in the parapolitical space, right? But to me, at least, I think it's critical to understand these abuses of power. You know what I mean? Like when we talk about MK Ultra, it is an abuse of power, but like, to what end is it being levied? I think you have to understand that like this is all about maintaining the current order. World War II is
hegemony.
Right, exactly. It's like, World War II was like a disruptive time for the entire world. I feel like, there is this like basic understanding in left spaces of like had to shut down the left after World War II, and they kept America's right. You don't just get the complacency overnight. You have to implement it by force in some contexts and by carrot and stick. And like we were talking earlier about, you have to highlight the contradictions that exist in a system. We kind of see that more so today, less so than when we look at the 60s, right? Where it's like a lot of people we'll look at the current state of things with climate, for example, right? And we'll be like, well, okay, we have all the science, we have all the data. They'll point to polls of like, well, 60% or so of people say we got to do something about climate change, right? But, the contradiction staring us all down in the face, like you said, is that the material reality that undergirds our whole system is the carbon economy. From clothes to entertainment to, literal transport, it all comes from petrochemicals. And that's why, the amount of climate conferences we've been having since the 80s, for example, right? Why do these never seem to go? Or when you talk about why does America always seem to pull out all the stops on this shit? It is because they don't want this current order to change. A lot of people from this. It sounds trite to say it like that, but I truly do believe that all what went into maintaining the system was for that. And then when you want to talk about some of the real deep shit, the scary shit, like Gladio, like the different coups we did. Mossadegh literally was shove power because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry, and he wasn't even a full-on communist. You know what I mean? He was, I think, the democratic socialist or progressive type, as far as I understand.
If Kennedy in a certain frame got whacked just for being a nicer kind of capitalist.
Right, right.
So, just I've heard some pretty compelling arguments that somebody was like, "Wait, you want to invest in these countries instead of just exploiting them? Fuck you."
No, and even within the socialist and communist movement, right, you have guys like Allende, right, who reject the revolutionary model and say we're going to vote ourselves in, we're going to compete within the legal framework, and they had to whack that guy too.
Yeah, I think there's I think that there can be a sort of a naivety to the extent that power can go, and I think one of the things that when you're inside of a structure where we've been talking about, where literally everything just feeds back into the carbon economy at a bare minimum. Most of it feeds back into its surveillance economy, but the vast majority of it feeds into a carbon economy when it's everything. When it's every single channel of dissent, when it's your communist podcasts, your protest music, your local church groups and mutual aid groups, when it's every single aspect of it is part and parcel, funded by and moves carbon through everything, even the best intentioned and kindest people, even the most far left-wing people, or the most devout religion, when you see a system that makes it so there's no way to actually be good, or to keep your hands clean, I think that there can be a big grinding against that. But I think what ends up happening is you spend all this time doing the grind against, and you don't really, you have to look at the way that we got here. They didn't defang your descent in a minute. They spent literally 4 generations. Yeah, we've been talking about, just fucking murking every single person who had a nicer version of the education system on the planet. Every
and not just that too, even
millions in the Philippines, I'm
right.
Every single fucking person. I'm not talking about the political leaders. I'm talking about the people who just gave a shit. There's a long history of Cointopro and chaos domestically going through people's shit. Oh, you dude, they never went after the Black Panthers for any of the fucking Marxist shit. They went after them because they were benefiting the communities through or okay, so that is a version of going through the Marxist shit, but the groups that have actually been out there got just totally annihilated years and years ago, and at this point all that's left is okay, do you want to do you want to write a little movie or a little song about full disclosure, I've been in a variety of punk bands in my life who have played a variety of political music, so I'm critiquing myself as much as anybody else in here. Do you want, if whatever you want to do We got a carbon economy for that. You want to put out a podcast? We got phones and computers for that. That you want to put out a record? You want to put out some like we've been talking about all day here. There's every single part of it has a component of the carbon economy into it. I think that thing can sort of drive you crazy as you look for ways out. The eternal question is, what does God want me to do with this information, or whatever deity you're talking to, or you can say that sarcastically if you want, which is also fun. But I think like insofar as the realm of like conspiracy theory versus parapolitics, I would say like parapolitics is I would say parapolitics is conspiracy theory plus Marxism. Or actually, I would say it's very specifically Marxism plus conspiracy theory. The first has to lead into the other one. Or not conspiracy theory, but what we would traditionally refer to as that. Like anything that you've done as much material analysis as you possibly can inside of the traditional narrative frameworks. And now you kind of gotta be like, well, I don't know. They killed all these, leaders throughout the third world right before Kennedy died. I don't know. Like, oh, there's Cheney saying we're going to need like another Pearl Harbor like a few years before 9/11. That's, shit will stick in your craw for sure.
Right.
No, I think there is like a big difference between like the realm of conspiracy theory versus the realm of parapolitics. But I think like, yeah, for me, I think it's the analysis that I have for all of this stuff comes down to like political actionability. Like, okay, what can you do about it? Not even like what are you going to do about it? What can you do about it? What could one do? Which is why when people are like, this band is an op, this podcast is an op, turn it off. Like, done. You've done the extent of what one person could do, inside of that. Like, I guess like maybe you could talk to some people about it. But there's no real like it doesn't really go anywhere, versus like, I think like the example that I bring up to people is the moon landing. There's a big debate over whether or not the moon landing was faked. And for me, it's like my opinion on the moon landing is that if it was accomplished, it was accomplished to distract from the entrenched poverty in America, and that it's a gross misusage of resources to put like a couple of dudes on the moon when you have millions starving here. I would say that NASA is a weapons contractor, and they always have been, and that's always been the name of the game. Like, so if you manage to get people into space or onto the moon or other planets, I don't think you're doing it for reasons of kindness, and I think that you can get sort of like, you can get lost in the weeds when you are just like, what if they did the moon landing to fuck with us? Like, that's not why that would have happened. Or that's not like the end of it. The fucking with you was not like the entire goal, And I think that I think that a recentering of materialism inside of this realm, and the way that sort of propaganda and materialism are tied into each other, how one creates a social reality that sort of grinds against the material reality of the other one. That's a space that needs to be examined a little bit more, because I think that's where like the real interesting politics happen. And it's not just in the, I don't know, like it's fun to sit around and talk about like whether or not like, Stanley Kubrick was admitting to doing the moon landing if you watch The Shining or something, but like I just don't see how that is going to lead to like, formative change. And especially insofar as having like conversations about, you were talking at the very beginning of all of this about like, how do you talk to people who are sort of maybe getting out of liberal thought, and or realizing that this is a wall you're going to hit against, or like, I think, what you and I were talking, there's like, I hate to date all this stuff, but there's like a little video going around right now that's like a TikTok that's what, like all these like 20-year-old kids who are like, I'm a libertarian, I'm a neoliberal or something, right? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like it's this like perfect encapsulation of, well, yeah, you're like, I remember like being 20 and living in a country where like Marxism and communism was like totally fucking
Yeah,
demonized.
I remember being a young Democrat. I remember it too well. Oh no.
Yeah, it's like, and so like but you realize that like, oh, okay, well, this whole like liberalism thing or is like this progressivism thing is just like not going to work, and so you don't think there's anywhere else to go, you know. So you end up being like, maybe I'll be a libertarian, you know, like, and so it's I as somebody who was very much like a teenage punk rock anarchist, God, I definitely cannot, you know. No offense to my anarchist comrades, but even they will have to admit that teenage punk rock, anything political type people are just insufferable. Um, you know, it's just like it's seeing where the trend goes out because there's no. I would say that maybe parapolitics is like the version of conspiracy theory that you talk to people about when they're starting to like realize that things aren't really there. Because like I would say that like the realms of like this Bolloré company and like oil distribution through the same cultural milieu that the counterculture and the record industry and the fast fashion industry were coming through. Those are examples of like, I think, actual like parapolitical interest, things that sort of play with the realms of like politics and government, but also finance and power. Because I mean, all of it's just like trying to figure out what this power thing is, and like, you know, I think that there's good examples throughout history that power is the sort of thing that moved through, at least from what we can see now from our very narrow scope of it, sort of like moved through like formed up through feudalism and then turned into mercantilism, then turned into capitalism, and capitalism took over the world. So you know that's
Yeah.
those three in a row are the frame that we use. Like and parapolitics, I think, like sort of looks at that that sort of things that you can bring up, like, because I mean, okay, you want to be like the 100th guy who's talking about how Kennedy got shot, or do you want to talk about how like, oh, like, well, there's this like larger trend of actions that happen, here's like the milieu that it happens in, um and it's yeah, it's sort of like, no, that's probably the end of what I got on that.
No, you're making sense here because like this is what I'm thinking about it, right? Is like a lot of the tinfoil left, as this subculture gets called, right? I think some of the stuff gets dismissed as being paranoid or too schizoid, right? And maybe there are some examples you could cite where it's like, okay, maybe this person too gratuitous with the connections they're making, right? I still think there is like a net benefit to the approach, and this is kind of going to come out of left field, right? But like when you look at the academy and the approach of putting everything into its own separate discipline, you got to be an expert in one field. You got to look at it like, something like climate change, right? That we understand to be, a function of various socioeconomic factors that went into making it a scientific reality, right? There's people who only come at it from economics, and if they do, they come at it from capitalist economics. There's people who come at it from science, and when they do come at it, they come at it from an engineering, you know what I mean? And there's this idea that like, oh, if I approach this with my disparate and incomplete field, I can come up with a totalizing solution for it. And I think that, the parapolitical approach is a rejection of that. And if you center it like an analysis of following the money, of looking at the key players, of looking at how they shaped things like markets and behaviors and patterns, you get a better explanation for how these things arise, right? And I don't necessarily think that, these like you said, like, if parapolitics is the merger of a Marxist approach and a conspiracy theory approach, I don't think these two have to necessarily live in conflict. right? You have like let's just go to everyone's favorite example, Epstein, right? You have
Your
these
favorite example?
yeah, I mean, just like as the most cited one, right? It gets a lot of attention, right?
Yeah.
Is that like um, you
My
have
favorite
these.
one is the Obama was a gay prostitute thing. But
Well, I mean, okay, but like to your point, right? Is like even if you could justify that was true, like what's actionable? There's one thing with like the Obama was a gay prostitute thing that everyone keeps bringing up, but then with stuff like Epstein, like there's those connections that make you lose your mind for a bit, right? Which is like, why is this guy connected to and Trump? Why were they doing these like horrible things to people, right? To what end was this being deployed? But then you think about it, it's like these are all people of a certain social class, all allegedly participating in like really heinous. And it kind of begs the question, like, and I think what this is the actionable part derived from it, which is, the elite in our country are held to markedly different standards of punishment and scrutiny. What they can get away with is pretty monstrous. The standard to punish them is pretty like threadbare if you look at the first time Epstein was arrested. And the fact that like, if you try to raise questions about it, people will tell you to shut up. You know what I mean?
oh yeah. No, it's no, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there where it's like you have to yeah, the way that you talk about all of these things is yeah, I've realized like you talk about capital. You talk about, it's a lot easier, I'll tell you this, man. It's a lot easier to talk about something like um yeah, something about like MK Ultra when you're already talking about oil, when you're
Mm-hmm.
already talking about the flow of money. Um and I mean, it's also like I think there's a different approach now to um in a post FOIA, like a post mass FOIA world or Freedom of Information Act request world, um, where you can tell everyone you want to the truth by just putting it on like one page of like 10,000 pages. You can just like
Mm-hmm.
dump all of the information into the world, and so I think we sort of moved from, and I've definitely been thinking about whether or not the difference between like conspiracy theory versus parapolitics is just going from a world where there was too little information to a world where there's too much. And so
Mm-hmm.
now there's like you used to have like no points of reference or like, once in a generation like a fucking an Alfred McCoy or a Gary Webb would come along and like blow the doors off the fucker. But like, it's been a long time since the Yankee Cowboy War was written. Like so, you
Mm-hmm.
have this sort of thing now where it's just like, okay, well now you're just in like full on information overload. And sort of what you were saying, you can make crazy connections because every single thing in the world is kind of connected inside of this like larger structural thing that's moving things hegemonically. And so it's like it's not only can you make connections, it's easy and logical to make those connections to a certain extent. You have to sort
Right.
of move things away from each other, but like you were saying with the academy and like the educational sort of structure in America or whatever, you can't move them too far because otherwise then you're just talking about disparate points, and those disparate points, like if you're trying to figure out how they relate to each other, like you can't just like fully separate them. You have to like let them play off each other, and I mean, to be honest, like I couldn't cite you a source on this, but I wonder how much of that is due to the hyper demographics of current media, where it's
Oh
just like,
yeah. Oh yeah.
this thing is here and that thing is there. It's like, yeah, the world's big enough for punk and post punk. Like you can have power violence and grind sections in your record store now. Like so, it becomes even more and more atomized at a certain point, because like yeah, the every single channel of information is actually a channel of media, and media has been broken down into very very niche demographics at this point. And so when you're trying to put things together, you're going to end up having to move through like a bunch of sources and a bunch of disciplines. And it's like, people have, it's always kind of wild to me. People ask like, oh, so what do you read or write to like prepare for some of like the longer things that you are going to, put together? And it's just like, it's not even that anymore. You're sort of picking up Twitter threads. It's not just books, it's like you're picking up Twitter threads, you're picking up podcasts, you're picking up like documentaries and movies, and like, sort of, you're going to learn a lot more about the surveillance state in America from watching a fucking Marvel movie than you are from reading any tome on it. It's all kind of right there. So yeah, I think it can be, there's definitely sort of a political economy to not making connections that you have to operate against. And it's really knowing how to make those connections and then present them. And I think that maintaining like firm footing, like both feet firmly planted in materialism with a head that's like not afraid to like get up in the clouds every once in a while, just to like see what's floating is, but it's also like, if I feel like if you can't recenter it on something that's like real in front of you, then that's that you're going to end up in some trouble. You're going to end up being sort of confused and kind of like mad about stuff. As somebody who lives in like a fairly blue city in a blue state like that, you meet a lot of people who are like, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and I straight up had somebody during that massive heat wave last year when it was like 115 out for a few days. Mm-hmm. I overheard somebody being like, I mean, everybody in this town drives a Tesla. How is this happening? He meant it, dude. He meant it. And it was just like, no, you get people who are seriously like, dude, no, I put the yard sign that says we believe up, and I bought a Tesla, and, I got like solar panels on my house, and it's people who are like, and I understand that. I try and be empathetic toward that frustration, because it's sort of the same thing that like all of us have sort of realized maybe a little bit earlier, like, wait, I did everything right.
But why am I still suffering? Yeah, it's that.
Yeah. Why is everything so shitty still? It's like, well, these are things that are sort of like larger than the self. But like, I mean, but I think you also have to, I don't know if it's any sort of like solution. For myself, I feel like my recentering with the world has definitely taken place with small scale gardening. I've definitely gotten more into. I found that's like a real good way to, to center around like both like your community and also like this sort of like the need to escape the larger capitalist structure. You can at least feel like you're making something grow and do better, or improve. It's a good way to remind yourself daily that like, as long as you can just like give something care, attention, and time, there's nothing that can't be healed or grown or made better. And I think it's yeah, you and I talked, I think, in the past about the sort of how, like, for lack of a better term, like ecology can be an easy way to start understanding dialectical materialism in your own life. Like,
oh yeah,
you see growing conditions for things that work and you don't do them. You see how like, oh, I need to have like, if I want these plants to do well, I need to attract these kind of pollinators. So I have to have these kind of flowers. So I have to have this kind of soil. And it sort of allows you can start to see a complex system and you can see how it works. And I think that, and I think that people I know who have gotten really into, woodworking or fixing cars or things that involve like a multi-tiered system that still makes logical sense. Like, I think like, in your question of how do you talk to people about these things, I think that there's a variety of systems that people are engaged in every day, and you can start to talk to them about them and then maybe if you find something that isn't super reliant on like the larger capitalist structure, and I know this is a silly thing to say. I have planter boxes that I bought the seeds that I have, bought the soil that I have, I pay my water bill every month, you know. But you know, like we've been talking about, where do you draw the line on my uber materialist understanding of the world driving me insane / making me incredibly depressed? And I think that that's like a decent way to do it is, you know, finding a system that's like directly in front of you or directly in front of like the people that you're talking to. Because I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, from what you and I have talked about, it sounds like you and me and a lot of other people are sort of, especially who are like a little more politically leftward inclined, are sort of surrounded by a lot of people who are like, I'm grinding against this. And, you know, let's be real. Like, if they're, you know, you and I were talking about all these like teenage libertarians. The teenage libertarian is the core of every American. These people are going to, you know, if we don't have like a thing to say or an understanding or some sort of communicative frame, it's not going to end up well for everybody here. And by here, I mean like the planet Earth that we all live on.
Well, right, and this ties back to like what you were saying about the individualist culture, like broadly in the West, but especially here in the United States, right? Is that, you know, if you were conditioned to see everything as an individual yourself, the libertarian approach is the only thing that seems appealing to you, especially like you've said, when you're conditioned against communism or any left approach for that matter.
Well, especially once you've figured out that all of this stuff isn't going to work, you know, it's just like the machine that we're all running on is just like it doesn't matter whether or not you like it. It's coming to a conclusion at some point, you know. It's not going to like, and realistically, it's probably going to be, you know, gunned down in the next like 10 years or so by just like, funnily enough, I would put my money on the insurance companies not insuring oil pipelines anymore. So it's just it. For real, man. Like if you had to really ask me what's going to end up happening, it's going to be an internal component of the system that so much of neoliberalism has been about moving the totality of the economy into a virtual state that has totally lost the ability to control its material realm anymore. And those two things are going to come into conflict, and we're all going to see it happen. We're going to be sitting around with phones that don't work because like the companies went out of business because the metadata disappeared, something that doesn't actually exist, you know. It's going to be things like that as the conceptual economy and the material economy sort of, you know, grind against each other, I think. But you know, it's, you know, I think, yeah, I don't think we necessarily have like a job. I would never want to make people feel like they have homework. But yeah, I think like having some sort of realm that you can talk to people on is a lot easier. And material reality that sort of is directly in front of you, be like, hey, neighbor, here's a potato. I grew this potato. Would you like a potato? You know, like that's that can be a lot more effective than, you know, coming in hot with like, you know, so they remote controlled the planes on the morning of 9/11. You know, get to that point. Don't start there. Like
Also, like with some of those like points that we get to in conspiracy theory, right? Like, I think they are instructive to just one end that I think people should do a better job of leading to, which is if any system is this mysterious, if it creates this many questions, it's probably a net bad, right? Like I think like that's what we can lead with is like,
I'm trying to think what I saw or heard Anna Merlin on, who wrote a Republic of Lies, you know, and like somebody asked her like what's like something you took away from studying conspiracy theory, and she was just like, well, countries that have high amounts of civic trust don't have conspiracy theories. There's no need. Like if you just have everything out in the open, then people don't need to like come up with crazy solutions for them. They don't need to go looking into all of it. It's just there. You just need to be transparent. Like, and so it's a big, I think, yeah, it's a larger question of like of being transparent and being available to people. And like on a larger like scale, and is involving our own interpersonal interactions with each other. But yeah, it's about like building trust, and trust is built on what's in front of you, not about like the things that are in the ether, you know.
Yeah, and it's still useful to look into the ether sometimes, right? Because like those,
Yeah. Oh, come on, we're here right now because we love
right,
looking into the ether, man.
right. Like I still
Waking
think
up
there's
early
some
on a
use.
Sunday morning to talk about the fucking ether, dude. Like, I wouldn't just wake up to talk about anything.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? It's like, when with some of this stuff, like you get into weird shit, which is like, what are these people doing? Why are they doing evil shit? And you get wrapped up in that question of like, what are evil people doing evil things for? But I think again, for me at least, it goes back to the point of like maintaining fucking hegemony.
Yeah, maintaining the order. Like, the evil. I mean, I want to say like I don't know if it was them specifically, but it was probably Subliminal Jihad on one of their episodes said something like like capitalism resembles like a black magic, like a blood sacrifice. And like I think, yeah, it's like you have to remember, like, no, the black magic blood sacrifice didn't exist first. Capitalism did. And then it created the conditions for this thing that's just like, annihilating all of us. So
Yeah, and I think people again, like they miss the forest for the trees, where it's like, okay, capitalism is black magic. It's like, no. The function is black magic, and
yeah,
it's bad. That's really what we're trying to say.
you're supposed to be bummed out that it resembles that so closely, that it.
Or even better, let's say it is black magic. Okay, now you have double the reason to fight against it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, you better put on your Gandalf the gray hat and fucking grab your staff, dude.
no, get your Gandalf the Grey hat and wrap tinfoil around it. That's how you keep yourself safe.
Yeah, I forgot what we were on about today. Yeah, your tinfoil Gandalf hat. I like that. Your tinfoil wizard hat.
I've got another angle I want to take this. We're gonna take a quick pee break, dear listener, and we'll be back in 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. I'm down too.
All right. I'll be right back.
Same here. I got a pee too.
Bolero Logistics is a global leader in international transport and logistics, featuring among the top 5 in Europe, with a continuously growing network spread over the whole European continent. Our strength is our local footprint, enabling us to remain close to our clients and their markets, combined with the development of strategic hubs at the crossroads of international trade to optimize and consolidate flows, and to guarantee the rates and capacity you need for both export and import. For our customers, we create and implement end-to-end solutions between Europe and all regions of the world, the Americas, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, where we've been present for more than 50 years. We operate the only Pan-African integrated network of logistics corridors serving the continent's hinterland.
I guess another angle to all this, because I feel like we've kind of, with the threads, we were able to point to why you should adopt a materialist analysis. We kind of talked about the difference between parapolitics and conspiracy theory. Another that I think we talked about in our discussions, and I think like I wanted to share with the listener to some extent, is also the way that like adopting a material framework is also useful for like personal recovery in a sense.
Oh yeah.
Because lately, like, I've been trying to like come to terms with like things that have happened to me when I was younger and stuff, right? And when you are traumatized, for example, right, like it's very easy to view certain events as like your own, and that is actually pretty detrimental to recovery and stuff, right? And as I, delved into Marxism and like materialist analysis as like a political project, right? I didn't anticipate the way in which it would also be freeing in a personal sense, right? Because I'm able to view things like my family history and the dynamics of, what I came out of as causes things that happened to me rather than personal failures or just like intrinsic weaknesses on my part. So I don't know if you wanted to expound on that, but that's something that I just wanted to share with the listeners is like, it's not just useful to you politically, it actually helps you contextualize things in so many other aspects.
Yeah, I think that so much of and there's a lot of American culture that is based on the perpetuation of trauma and abuse cycles.
Mhm.
And I think yeah, when Um, this is something I've talked about on my feed, and so like on my timeline, so I'm not like shy about it. I'm a non-drinking alcoholic. And both of my parents died from alcoholism. And the main use for me personally that I have gotten out of um specifically Marxist and materialist analysis is that there's a narrative that sort of shapes any sort of abuse that you went through or trauma that you went through or addiction in as being these sorts of personal failures, and that the reason these things happen is because like you like people are just like shitty human beings. And yeah, I don't really have like an answer for whether or not I'm a good person. That's kind of a weird one. Um, but like, I don't think my parents were pieces of shit. I think my parents were people who tried really hard and ended up becoming victims of like these larger structures, like, and they're gone, so they can't get mad at me for saying this stuff. Like, my dad was in a household with like a ton of abuse, and he started drinking as a teenager. My mom was somebody who died, I think, a very classic American death of despair. She was like, she was a white collar professional who lost her job, and the market started to shrink around people who were older, and so she started to drink more to deal with it. And it's and you look at those things, and then you look at yourself, and you're like, well, these are that's not like that's not somebody like drinking because they were these things all stemmed out of like much larger, more obvious socioeconomic conditions. The and my father had a very like masculine father who was like, you gotta rule the house with a fist. And so it's like you see the way that like patriarchy causes trauma and addiction. You see the way that like capitalism drives trauma and addiction. You see the way that like all of these systems, and throughout all of this, what did my parents tell me? Like, well, you just gotta like put your nose to the grindstone and go to work every day and do that. And so it's like, and you see the way that the reinforcement of these abuse cycles is actually beneficial to the system, how it beats the people inside of it into not having the time or the energy or even the interest in the understanding for something larger to help them escape it. And I think that I think it can be incredibly powerful when you finally make that sort of cognitive understanding through reading, and through understanding these like these larger, for lack of a better term, like left-wing concepts, Marxist concepts, materialist concepts. Like you start to understand that systems exist and they sort of are running in ways that you really can't control, that you just sort of have to react to or adapt to. Or because it's Marxist theory, it's also brave enough to say, or what if we changed it? And that I think is, for me has been one of the, I've told people I've I lost two very important people to me through deaths of despair. And my political orientation is whatever prevents that from happening to anybody else ever again for any reason. And communism is the path that seems closest to it. It's the one that provides the housing and the food and the medicine and the dignity. And I guess if you really want to split hairs, like like a third world nationalism is cool too. But I think that and yeah, there's definitely times that I've known people like I don't know about you personally, but I know people that have been very bummed out or in a bad place in their lives, have been like, have you read this or that, or the other thing that would be typically referred to as like left-wing literature that has really improved their lives, like the power that you can give somebody who's like an office drone when you give them like a copy of Capitalist Realism, like the power that you can give like a a young woman of color when you introduce her to Angela Davis when she has like these things are these like really these like powerful things that like I think like maybe kind of get lost in like the first world understanding of things, but like I don't know. And I feel like as I've gotten older, like when you're younger, you have people who tell you like these were the things that were important to me. It's like fiction authors, and you get older and people are like, oh well, the things that actually mattered to me were like the really intense, like the things that help me relate, and especially in a world that like the hegemony is sort of deconstructing in. A lot of that stuff is the stuff that helps to, I this has kind of gotten me some flack from people who are, I'm like a middle millennial. And I'm personally of the opinion that the Zoomers are, like basically anybody born post 9/11 is like so much more capable of being on the ball and of seeing the large system of like trauma replication than anybody born before it because they've lived inside of its structure for so long that like they're able to like really critique it really thoroughly. And like I think like anybody who kind of can't remember the world before the internet is going to do a little bit better with it than people who are maybe like my age who like I was born in 1984, so I was like 16 maybe when we got an internet connection, it's like so I have like this entire realm of understanding of it beforehand, and like after that it's like you have this world that like kind of existed alongside one narrative track and then started to collapse during information overload. And inside of that, I think is the potential for more and more people to see more and more types of information. And like, I don't know, I'm also not really like a super I've gotten value out of reading Kaczynski's work or, like Zerzin's work, but like I'm also not like a super anti-tech guy. Like I think it's introduced a lot of people who wouldn't have gotten access to this information and channels of like knowledge like to do really wonderful things like and to like really make change happen. And I think like there's a lot of critique amongst like people in the first world about whether or not it's good, but I think you would be hard pressed to find somebody I don't know I don't want to like do that like third world glamorization thing or whatever, but like what's like the story of like that dude in like Eastern Africa who like managed to like build like a water tower or something for his community. It's like, okay, well, like go tell that dude that the internet sucks. Like, this dude who like downloaded the schematics and like, like built the thing. Like so yeah, there's which is kind of like a ramble off of what we were on, but yeah, I think that I think a solid left-wing analysis can improve your world in a number of ways. And yeah, definitely I think helping you recenter your own grief and your own trauma and the bad things that have happened to you inside of ways that don't make you a victim but help you, and none of this necessarily empower you either, but just like remove you from that dynamic. It's like you are neither victim nor empowered. You're irrelevant. The system just does things, and you're one of the things that it did. I personally think there's like way too much emphasis on like saying systems are evil because they're not. They don't. That's putting a human characteristic on it.
But they serve evil ends.
Yeah,
That's
they serve evil ends.
Say.
But it's just like capitalism did not have a bad intention when it did a thing to you. It doesn't operate with intentions. It operates along a fucking rail.
It's a machine. It's a machine.
Yeah,
What's that sticker? This machine doesn't know the difference between flesh and metal.
And
nor does it care.
Nor does it care. What did Barry say that she was going to get that as a tramp stamp? So yeah, I think it's been a net positive in my entire life, but definitely the parts of my world that, well, and it's like it relates to the garden stuff too, though. You're wondering why your plants won't grow. Well, is there like a systemic reason, or are you a bad gardener? Like, I'm having a hard time like understanding this piece of work or this, this book, or like, well, are you a bad reader, or is this like inside of like a structure that's different from like the ones that you're used to? Well, that's
exactly
me talking to people the first time they read Frederick Jameson. Like, so, yeah, I don't know if you've had anybody outside of you personally that you've ended up sort of moving left-wing theory through in a personal way. But yeah, it's generally worked out like pretty well for me, and people are generally like, there's a power to getting that vocabulary and that understanding for the first time, you know? The first time that you really understand, like, I am not at fault here. I'm not a piece of shit, you know? And that's not going to be given to you by like a piece of like liberal theory or like, you know, no offense to like any of the various anon groups, or not like QAnon. I mean like Alcoholics Anonymous. Jesus. um, um, and it's not going to come to you from any of that stuff. It's going to come to you through systemic analysis.
Yeah, and I mean, this is really what I was hoping to, I mean, we've talked about this in so many in our discussion, but I think to understand things are so dysfunctional, you have to look power in the face, and then you have to be willing to wrestle contradiction, at least mentally. Because I think we all agree that we want things to change, we want things to be better, but I think we get so caught up in the confusion and the chaos and the sheer dysfunction of the current system that we get blinded by how bad it is in a way, right? And I think that, it takes I'm not using the word in like a weird way. Like this is what came to my mind is like to reckon with the world as it stands. And then using that as like a template, a baseline for what you want to change. Because you can talk about what its mechanisms are and why why they're unjust, why they perpetuate sorrow and suffering, right? That gives you, the leg up you need to talk about a better world. At least I think that's what you think. And, I hope God we did, Marx and Engels, our sales pitch for materialist analysis. Maybe they're rolling in their graves, but
I mean,
that's
like,
what I stand by.
Mark seems like he just chilled for so much of the day. I hope he'd just be like, you know what? God bless you, crazy kids. You're really going for it.
Hope.
I mean, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch on. I mean, I'm down. It's up to you though.
I'm trying to think because it's like I just looked at the notification. We've been recording for hours at least. I will have to trim a couple of this,
Yeah,
a couple.
we've been recording for like an hour and a half or so.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I said everything I wanted to say. Do you have any like parting thoughts you want to share with the listener before we get into closing out and plugs?
Not that I can think of. I mean, this is the first time I've ever done a podcast, so I think I've roughly gone over everything I wanted to talk about. I talked about gardening and the threads and like addiction and stuff. So yeah, I'm good.
Oh yeah, no, I wanted to let you you were pretty good, and I wanted to let you keep going because you were kind of like running the show for a bit, and I think you did a good job.
I mean, a little bit of the tinfoil chat hosting has done some of that, just like
Yeah.
So, but yeah, just kick into the outro monologue.
All right. Well, this show is Greenhouse Gaslighting, and we had on Charlie today. You can follow him on Twitter at Heavenly Spit. Periodically.
Thanks for having me on. This was fun.
Yeah. Do you want me to plug the Twitter space too, or?
Yeah, you can follow me at Heavenly Spit. I write threads and I say other stupid stuff about like books I'm reading generally. A couple times a week, I host a Twitter space called Tinfoil Chat. You can pop on in there and yell at me if there's anything I said here that you don't like. You'll see audio in there on occasion too, and other random parapolitics people. But it's fun, and there's some. I think that there's a really interesting and insightful core group of people that sort of pop in and talk about really interesting stuff. And so otherwise, no, I don't have any plugs or anything at this point in my life. I have a Twitter account, and the Twitter account has a space. But yeah, thanks very much for having me. This was a lot of fun. It was great to talk to you earlier in the morning than usual.
Hey, it was my pleasure having you. This show is Greenhouse Gaslighting. You can follow us on Twitter at @PodGreenhouse. I got the links to all the other socials in the description below. Peace out, folks. Take care.
Bye.